Velkommen til jer alle sammen. Hvor er det dejligt, at der er så mange, der har trodset det gode vejr og er kommet herned for at møde Cecilia. Det kan jeg godt forstå, for hun er en rigtig spændende person. Så jeg har også glædet mig rigtig meget til at møde hende i dag. Jeg hedder Gitte Lykkegaard, og jeg er en af Cecilias læsere. Og den eneste forskel på mig og jer, det er, at jeg er nabo til Peter og Pernille, som har boghandleren. Og sådan er det jo her på Bornholm. Det kender I jo alle sammen, at vi hjælper hinanden, og vi gør hinanden tjenester. Og Pernille og Peter havde brug for, at der var en, der sad heroppe på scenen i dag og stillede Cecilia nogle spørgsmål, og det ville jeg rigtig gerne. Jeg er en stor fan af Cecilia, og har læst hendes første bog, Signor Peregrino, som nogle af jer også har læst. Og så har jeg faktisk fået lov at smuglæse Drømmehjerte, som er den nye bog, der udkommer i dag. Nogle af jer var måske med på Rasches Pakhus, dengang Cecilia var her for første gang. Og flere af jer bød ind med spørgsmål undervejs. Det håber jeg også, I vil gøre i dag. Men I har jo ikke læst Drømmehjerte, og det har jeg. Så jeg har forberedt nogle spørgsmål, som jeg stiller, men det skal ikke forhindre jer i at bryde ind undervejs og lige række en pote op, og så får I en mikrofon, så I kan få lov at stille Cecilia et spørgsmål. Og hvis I har det bedre med at stille det på dansk, så gør I bare det, og så prøver jeg at hjælpe med at oversætte det til engelsk. Så sådan kommer det til at forløbe i dag. Rigtig hjertelig velkommen til alle sammen. Og velkommen til Cecilia.
Thank you so much.
Er lyden okay?
Is this okay with the? Is the sound okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
Is it you?
I think it's me. Is
Yeah.
it? Is it my hair? Our technical expert is coming here to. I think I'm breathing too loudly.
Yeah. Are we breathing too loud? It's Cecilia's nose. Okay.
Yes, it's a big Spanish nose. It has to get in the way. That's better? Yes, that's better. That's it. Thank you very much.
Cecilia, you and I have met once before.
Yes.
That was in October when you were here to talk about your novel, Signor Peregrino, which was the first of your novels to be translated into Danish. And we met because we were both interviewed for the radio. You as the author and I was a reader. And today we get to continue our conversation because your new book, Dream Heart, which is actually your first novel.
Yes.
Yeah. It's published today, isn't it?
Today is I'm told it's the official publication day.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm delighted to be here in Bornholm on this official publication day.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's very nice. Apparently a lot of the other readers are very delighted that you're here too, since they came in here despite the sun outside.
Yes, I really appreciate this. It's very difficult to be inside on such a beautiful day.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And you fell in love with Bornholm last time you were here.
I can't imagine anybody coming to Bornholm and not falling in love with it. And when I left, I thought, oh my goodness, I hope that I get to return someday, because you never know when you leave a beautiful place if you'll ever have a chance to return. So I never thought it would be so soon.
No.
But I couldn't be happier. But my husband is very jealous. He came with me last time. He wasn't able to come this time, so he's not too happy about it.
No.
I'll tell him about how beautiful it was, and he'll be okay.
Yeah, yeah. When I said goodbye to you last time in October, you said, I'll be back, I'll come back to Bornholm one day. And I thought, yeah, right. She's an American, and that's the American way of saying, nice to meet you. But you came back 6 months later, and that's very nice. Yeah, some of the readers here, they have read your book, Signor Peregrino. But some of them haven't met you before, so they are here for the first time to see you. So I think we should begin by you introducing yourself and telling who you are.
Sure.
And when you've done that, I think we should talk about your latest novel, Dream Heart, but also continue with talking about Senor Peregrino.
Absolutely.
Because probably some of the readers got your book the last time and they have read it in the meantime. So it would be interesting to talk about that one too. And I think that both Dreamheart and Senor Peregrino have some common features that could be interesting.
Great. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted to talk about both Senor Peregrino and a Dreamheart and any other questions that any of you may have, either in the group or later if we get a chance to talk, that would be nice too. I am a novelist, but even before that, my training is in psychology, so I've worked most of my professional and adult life as a therapist, listening to stories from my clients, and most of my clients have come from many different parts of the world, mostly Latin America, because I myself am an immigrant. I was born in Cuba during the revolution, and my family left. And so I have this experience with living in two cultures. And I understand some of the struggles and some of the pain involved with that. My first language is Spanish, although I write in English. And so when it came time for me to begin a practice, it made sense that I would use my Spanish skills with the Latin American immigrants, which is a very large population in Los Angeles, where I live. And so that's been my background. It's a very unorthodox kind of training for a writer, I guess you would say. But I think it's an ideal training because I've been listening to so many real-life stories. I've been hearing incredible experiences from my clients. And I've also had I think over the years, really developed an appreciation for the power of storytelling and the healing that one can both receive and give as a storyteller and as a listener. And I think for me, one of the greatest compliments I can have as a storyteller, which is, I see myself more as a storyteller than I do a writer, is when I tell a story and somebody says, "That was great, now let me tell you my story." Because I think that's what stories do, is that they encourage us to reflect on our own stories, and stories inspire stories, and that's the kind of really deep, respectful communication that I think can change people's lives. I was very influenced by my grandfather. I think I spoke a little bit about that last time, who was a wonderful storyteller, and the primary thing he taught me was that when you tell a story that is honest and it has deep heart, the rest just kind of works. You know, you can reach people that way, and he reached me that way, and I try in my own way to always remember that as I write. And so that's a part of certainly Drömhjärta, and I hope Senor Peregrino and my other stories. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Family is quite essential in both your novels,
yes,
both the ones I've read.
Yeah.
Dreamheart was your first novel. Why was that important to write as your first novel?
Well, Dreamheart is a sort of it is a fictional story, but in a way it is an autobiography, in a way. And it's written as a memoir. Now the difference is that the characters in the story leave Cuba, the primary characters, when she's 15. I left Cuba when I was 9 months old. But at the time that I turned 15, which is a time that many of us are asking ourselves, you know, who am I? What is the purpose of my life? And, you know, those kinds of teenage questions of identity. At that age, I was asking myself a lot about my background, and, you know, I was struggling with that because I lived in a community where everybody was pretty much American. I mean, I lived in a very mainstream American community, and my family was not, and I was not. And I wasn't very happy with that, to be honest with you. It was difficult. I wanted to be like all of my friends. I wanted to, when we came home, I was sometimes embarrassed when my friends heard my parents speaking in Spanish and my grandparents speaking in Spanish. So I had a lot of questions I asked myself, and I went through a process of really years of trying to figure out who I was and also what my life would have been like had I not left Cuba at the time of the revolution. So when I was quite a bit older, I began writing this novel as a way of answering that question for myself, of trying to make sense of these two sides of who I was. It was a kind of self-therapy. I think writing is very many people, I think, understand this and use writing as a form of clarifying their thoughts and their feelings and their visions for themselves and their lives. So it really began in that way, and it continued to evolve. Many of the stories and situations that are present in the novel are inspired from true life events, things that happened to my parents, my grandparents, my cousins, friends, and so I've put them together in a sort of a tapestry, and it really is an homage to them. And so for me, it was the first novel that I had to write before I could write anything else. I needed to make sense of that in my mind before I could move on.
Yeah. What can we recognize exactly from the book, from your life and your family?
Well,
or maybe you should start by telling what is the book about, in short.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because I realize it's out today. Many of you haven't had a chance to read it, because it's not like you're really fast readers. The book is about a family that is living a very idyllic life in Cuba before the revolution. The revolution took place in 1959. And then suddenly the world changed for many Cubans. And there were people who chose to stay in Cuba, and either they were with the revolution or they didn't think the revolution was going to last very long, the changes that were taking place. But there were a great number of Cubans who chose to leave the country for fear of what might happen. And this is a story about a family that is split apart. One family leaves for the United States and the other family stays. And it's about a very strong relationship of two girls who are cousins, almost like sisters, who stay in contact over the years, and they write to each other, and they help each other survive and deal with the challenges that both face. One of the characters, Nora, faces the challenge of adjusting to a new world and trying to find herself and understand who she was in the United States. And the other is struggling with the slow but steady destruction of her country over time. And it's this power of their relationship and the friendship that really keeps them whole and allows them to retain their dignity in the face of some pretty tough situations.
Yeah. Nora and Alicia, the two cousins and main characters of the novel, they are part of the upper class, or at least they have money, they have servants. Life is quite easy for both grown-up and children. I know that we are looking at life through children's eyes in the beginning of the novel, but still it seems like there are a lot of family dinners and parties and no lack of money. Is that what it was like for your family before you left Cuba?
Well, I didn't come from a particularly privileged family. My father worked his way through college, and he sort of he wasn't given anything. He worked his way through college. He became a very successful businessman, and that was before the revolution. There was a thriving middle class, and I would say the family depicted here would be upper middle class. Certainly not the real privileged. At some of the very, very privileged families in Cuba at that time were, and I don't want to, digress too much, but some of them were really in with the corrupt government at the time. And there were lots of favors and lots of bribes and lots of things that were going on at a very upper echelon, which was something that the intelligentsia or the professional classes didn't like. And that was one of the reasons that it was easy for Castro to come in, because most of the middle class and the upper middle class of Cuba and the lower classes detested Batista and his corrupt government. They wanted free and democratic elections. they didn't get that, but that was what they were hoping for.
Yeah. But we sense that not everyone in the family agree on what should happen. The fathers of the two cousins, they don't agree. We get the feeling that they argue sometimes during family dinners. Should they follow Fidel Castro, or should they? Is it better with Batista?
Right.
So there is some kind of.
Oh yes, I mean I think that's true in so many families. When you start, I mean, as I say, politics and religion, it's a dangerous thing to discuss, and it definitely was there because progress can be achieved in so many different ways, and definitely in my family, even now, when we talk about what's happened in Cuba, what might happen, even what's happening in the United States, it can become a very heated discussion. And I think it's interesting because in the novel it's the children who are listening to this discussion that the parents are having, and the older generation, and they're trying to make sense. And I wanted to explore it from the child's perspective, because I think the children have such a clarity of mind often, and are able to see beneath kind of the stuff and the rhetoric, and just understand, what works and what doesn't, and what do I trust and what don't I trust. And so for me it was interesting to write from that perspective, because also that was my life as I was growing up and listening to all of the things that had happened to our family. I was a little, and I was trying to understand, why did we leave our country? Why did we have something now, and why are we doing with so little? Because when we first moved to the United States, we were poor for a very long time. And so I was, trying to make sense of that, and I wanted to reflect the dilemma that children experience.
In the novel, you let someone have a voice, and that's a servant of Nora's family. What do you say? Do you call her Biba?
Beba.
Beba. Beba. She's the one that translates everything for the children when their parents are arguing. They go into the kitchen and ask Beba, what is going on? What is right? What is wrong?
Yes.
And she tells us from the beginning, I don't trust Fidel Castro.
Yes.
Is that your feeling coming through?
Well,
there?
let me tell you about Beba. Beba was a real character. I wrote her exactly as she was described to me. And a very powerful woman. She was a santera. And she dressed, this was the sort of the, I guess you would say, the shamanistic sort of religion of Cuba at the time. And she dressed all in white. Very powerful woman. And she had an incredible intuition. And there was a time at the beginning of the revolution where everybody thought things were going okay, and they trusted that the country was going to get right on track and things would be well. But Beba had this ability to listen to the speeches that Castro would give. Sometimes they would last hours and hours and hours. And she was the first one that said to my parents, I don't trust a word he's saying. I don't think he's honest. And this is going to end badly. And my parents would say to her, no, come on, you're just being a little paranoid. It's okay, it's going to be better than it was. But she was absolutely right. And in many ways, she was, as depicted in the novel, perhaps she was the quote-unquote servant, but she was really a rock in that family. And she was one that people turned to again and again for advice and get her opinion, and she wasn't afraid of anyone.
And as a reader, you get to care a lot about Beba, I think. She's also a little bit funny.
Yes.
She says about Fidel Castro in the beginning, you can't trust a man who can make that long speeches.
Right, that's right. And she was right, absolutely.
Yeah, because there was a hope that Fidel Castro would bring democracy and free elections for the country, and the family, they hope for quite a long time that this is what's going to happen.
Yes.
But during the years, they have to realize that's not what happened. For how many years did your family stay with Fidel Castro? Yeah, with the hope. Before leaving for America.
Well, we left in 1962.
Okay.
But my parents became very disillusioned very quickly. The minute that shortages started happening, almost immediately, assets were frozen. So if your bank accounts were confiscated by the government, immediately, one starts to suspect it's not going to go well when that happens. And so immediately they started making plans to get out and apply for visas, and there were arrangements made, political arrangements with the United States, that those who didn't want to live under a dictatorship would be allowed for a certain window of opportunity. And my family was lucky to have been one of the few that could get out early. It was really a lottery system. And if you happened to draw the right number, you would get out earlier than others. I had cousins that didn't get out for years later. Because they just drew a bad number. It just it wasn't as easy for them. But in terms of how long has my family hoped that things will change, because first was the hope that there would be democracy, and then came the hope that, well, this whole business would end quickly. Because the idea was that how long would the United States tolerate a communist dictatorship so close, 90 miles away? And so I think that they're still hoping. It's been 50 years.
And they
they're
haven't
still
been
hoping.
back for 50 years?
No.
Why is that?
Well, it's very difficult for Americans to go to Cuba, even Cuban Americans. And unless you have family there, you can't go. And then there's also a moral promise that many Cubans have made, and this is true for my family, that until Cuba is free, they will not step foot on Cuban soil again. And from, that's tough for me to deal with, because my parents are, my father's 81 and my mother's 72. So they're getting older. And my great dream is that one day I will go back to Cuba with them. I certainly have contemplated the possibility of going on my own, sort of sneaking over without anybody knowing. But I don't think I could live with myself. I think I'd feel so guilty. I don't think I could do it, as much as I would really love to see it.
So though you were 9 months old when you left Cuba, you still feel that moral obligation of not coming back?
I feel it toward my parents. I've seen how they suffered with the loss and how they struggled to make a life for themselves. And for me, going back against their wishes would be a very, very painful thing. I don't think I could do it. Now, the character in the novel does it. So I was, Nora goes back.
Nora goes
yes,
back,
she goes back. And in many ways, this novel has been my psychological journey home. I haven't been able to go in flesh and blood. But in some ways, I feel like I have been back in writing this novel. And it's offered me some peace and some resolution. It can hold me over for a while.
Because at some point, Nora has to go back. She has to help her cousin Alicia, who stayed back. And we get to experience Cuba as it is when she comes back. The poverty, the lack of food, all the bad things that have happened to Cuba. So how do you know that? Are they stories from people who went back?
Oh, yes.
Or from Cubans?
Well, people in my family and circle of friends from Cuba have left at various times post-revolutionary. So we've heard about how things have been at different times after the revolution. And there's also a fair amount of, underground information that gets out and you can hear about. So we're pretty well informed as to what the living conditions are for most people in Cuba, and I certainly wanted to reflect that here in the novel.
It's said that this novel is a declaration of love for Cuba as it was. But is it also a declaration of love for Cuba as it is?
I think it's a testament of hope for Cuba. I realize that the Cuba that I write about in this book is dead. You see, it died many years ago. The culture that my parents have talked about, the stories that they've shared with me, it's gone, and it will never, never be back. And I think that is the sadness, that is the grief of losing a culture forever. I think that Cuba will, rise out of the ashes. I think that Cuba will one day rebuild itself, but it will be something else. It won't be what it was. And my cousins and I, who are first generation, this book is dedicated to the cousins, for the cousins, because we're all first generation immigrants, and so we never really got the opportunity to experience our homeland where we came from, and we never will. But we have to, we have this dream, this fantasy, this nostalgia that we live with, and we know it's kind of fanciful, but it's all we have. And that's, why I wrote it, because I want to offer something like that we can hang our hats on. It's something. And it's something that many people all over the world have had to live with, not just Cubans. Many people who've lost their homelands, or who've had to move, and who've had to deal with adjusting to new life and figuring out who they are in that new world.
The story is quite relevant these days. When you look at the Middle East and the Northern African countries, they are fighting for democracy and free elections too. They want to get their leaders out of the country, and some of them have to leave their own countries.
Oh, yes.
Do you think life will be different for these people who are fighting for the same things that the Cubans were in the 60s? Do you think are we wiser now, people, or will it take 50 years again for these people to come home?
Well, I think that, kind of answering your question a little differently, I think that there's just so much that people can take. And after years and years of oppression, people all over the world want the same things, I believe, for themselves and for their families. They want to be able to express their thoughts without fear of oppression, imprisonment, some kind of punishment, their children, and they want to have the hope for progress and to be able to work hard and make something of their lives. That's basically what we all want. Be they in the Middle East or Cuba or in Scandinavia, that's what we all want. And in the Middle East, I think that the social media and the internet has played such a role in helping people to connect and communicate these ideas and encourage each other and embolden each other. And that kind of collective energy really makes people feel courageous that they can do it. That's lacking in Cuba. There is almost no internet access for people there. They're an island, they're very isolated, and having internet is illegal unless you have a special license, and even if you have that, you don't have access to every website that you want. The government's very careful about what they allow people to listen to. In fact, I just spoke to a journalist in Finland a couple of days ago who was in Cuba a few days ago herself, and she said that she was stunned that nobody she talked to in Cuba knew what was going on in the Middle East. I had no idea. And that's a very deliberate strategy from the government. They don't want their people to know that others are uprising against dictators that have been in place for 50 years. And they have very, very tight control of that. So it's a huge obstacle for Cubans to overcome. But that doesn't mean that they don't want it. They do.
So there's still people fighting for their freedom, and
there are a lot of brave-hearted dissidents in Cuba, but they get silenced very quickly. Or they either get kicked out. There's a saying in Cuba that says, if you are a dissident, you are either in jail, out of the country, or 6 feet under.
Yeah. It's very obvious that you have a great deal of love for Cuba when you read the book. In the beginning, it's described as paradise almost. It's centered around the beach where the two cousins spend a lot of time, and we hear about the sea and the sky and the smells and everything. Do you think that's gone today?
I think that natural beauty is not even a tyrannical government can ruin that. I mean, I think that is definitely still there. It's definitely probably a very healing energy for the Cubans that are present. I think that aspect is there. And there's some aspects of the culture that are still alive, but they're wounded. You know, they're wounded people.
In the beginning of the book, you, as a reader, you want to go there. In the end, you are not that eager, maybe. One of the important feelings in this book is the loss of one's home, the absence of one's home. One of the cousins, she stays in Cuba. The other cousin, she goes to America. And it's not an easy choice, neither to stay or to go. In Bornholm, we don't have a Fidel Castro here, and we didn't have a revolution.
Thank God.
But some of us have had to leave this island anyway. And as a person from Bornholm, I've had to do that too. I've had to live in... I haven't had to live, but I went to Copenhagen and stayed there for 15 years to get an education, and I worked there. And I think a lot of the readers sitting here, they have had to leave Bornholm too to get an education or a job for some years of their lives. So I think that the readers of Bornholm will identify with some of the feelings in the book, because we know what it's like not to be around our grandparents, or for parents to not being able to seeing their grandchildren grow up, and so on. So I think it's kind of a universal feeling, maybe.
I agree with you, and I don't think there has to be great political revolution for people to understand what many of the characters are feeling here. And I think there is something about those who leave home and who yearn for home and who struggle with those feelings that, well, like the characters in this novel, they come to a place where they realize that home isn't a place necessarily. It's a state of mind. It's a kind of understanding that you have about yourself, and a peace that you develop, that you have with yourself, and an acceptance, and the relationships that you're able to establish with others. Because I think what invariably happens to people that leave home, I would guess that when you left Bornholm to study, even though you felt like you still yearned for home, there's something about being away that changes you, whether you want it to or not. So that when you go back, well, you know, it isn't exactly what I remembered. It's different now. And that's because you're different. And the experience away changes you. And I think people who've had that back and forth experience, kind of, it can be a little disorienting, and sometimes it's disturbing, because you yearn for that security, that something, that essence that made you feel like it was going to be okay all the time. And you have to find it a different way. You have to find it inside. You have to find it within yourself. And so those kinds of inspirations don't come without pain. There has to be pain to get there. And so that's, I guess, the silver lining. Those struggles force people to grow and to deepen their experience of life, and that brings joy, deeper joy, I think. So the characters here have experienced a lot of pain, and it's not always a happy ending, but I think there is still a profound joy that comes from having a sense that they made choices that were authentic, and they tried to find answers.
The characters in the book, and also us from Bornholm, leaving Bornholm, I think you get very much aware of your identity. Suddenly you're not just a Dane. No, you are from Bornholm when you're staying in Copenhagen or Jutland or wherever you're staying. And when you go to Bornholm, you bring back sausages or whatever that are traditional dishes from here. You can read about that too in your novel. There are a lot of dishes described. Cuban food is a very big part of...
Food is such an integral part of culture, and it's a way that we can fill our senses with all manner of feelings and remembrances and connections with people. And usually we eat with others, and so it's a powerful way of... I know in my family it's definitely a powerful way of keeping our culture alive together. It's a little bit of Cuba, a little bit of the past, and we can sort of maybe fool ourselves for a couple of hours into thinking that it's still there, it's still alive. And maybe it is, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe it is.
I know that you're going to read a part of your book for us. It's the part where the family, Nora's family, make the very, very difficult decision to leave Cuba.
Yes.
Will you read that for us?
I will.
Or do you want to say something first?
Yes, I do. This was a part of the novel that was very hard for me to write because it was true. It was a very real incident that occurred to my parents. Because you see, what happened during the revolution is that right afterward, when people wanted to leave and get out and save their families, the government was losing a lot of their intelligentsia, the businessmen, the doctors, the people that, you know, were running the country, so to speak. And what they would do is that they would not give all of the family a visa. They might give the father a visa and not the mother. And that way, they would split families and encourage them not to leave. If you ever were to give up a visa, say you were given a visa and you say, no, I'm not going to use it, you'd never get another one. So their hope was that if they did this splitting up of visas, people wouldn't leave. And that happened to my parents. My mother got a visa, and I got a visa. I was 9 months old, but my father didn't. And so they went to the airport knowing that they might not see each other for years, or they might not see each other ever again, because people were going to prisons and being executed without trial very commonly after those times. Anyone that wasn't with the government was at great risk. And so this part opens up as the family is going to the airport to say goodbye to their country, but also to say goodbye to each other. Abuelo means grandfather in Spanish. Abuelo was weaving his way swiftly through the crowd. His face twitched when he neared, and his desperation swept over us like a furious wave. We were no longer sad and contemplative, but energized with the need to get on with it, this business of saying goodbye to our home, to Papi, to everything we were. Abuelo was so nervous he could hardly speak. Since sweet, calm Abuelo was never nervous, the pit of my stomach fell to my feet. Everything was falling down around me, but I still wanted to stay with all my heart. Abuelo pressed Papi's shoulder. "The plane is boarding," he said. Papi looked at his watch. "They shouldn't be boarding for another hour, Papa." "Look at this place," he said. "Does it look like anyone here knows what's going on? This is a madhouse, and I'm telling you that your plane is boarding now." Abuelo never yelled, but he did so now, and his face assumed a tightness that pulled the corners of his mouth down taut. Mommy straightened to attention and her eyes cleared. She shook herself. "We can't miss the plane. You heard what he said," she snapped, looking straight ahead. We almost ran behind her and Abuelo to keep up. We arrived at the gate out of breath, with our hearts in our throats as we joined the end of the line, trailing through the door out to the plane that reflected the tropical sun like Beba's pots and pans after she polished them. A middle-aged lady in front of us wept as a female official inspected her suitcase. The official took great pleasure in ripping the photographs she found one by one and tossing them onto the floor. She had a full mouth and wide-set almond eyes. She would have been considered very, very pretty if not for the sneer that cut across her face. "Get in line here," Abuelo commanded, unmoved by the scene before us. "Give me your visas." Papi handed him the 3 visas and stood with Abuelo outside the rope. We looked at the flight number on the board. This was not our flight, but we got in line anyway when we saw the look on Abuelo's face. He wasn't confused at all. He knew exactly what he was doing. When it was our turn to give the clerk our tickets, Abuelo stood close to him and passed him our visas, though his body blocked what he was doing. But I saw him slip several dollars into the front flap of one of our passports and remembered that Abuelo had money invested in an American bank account. The clerk examined the passports and visas, then glared at Papi. "Sir," he said, "didn't you read the sign? Passengers boarding the plane must stand inside the rope." Papi looked confused, but when he saw Abuelo nod and lift the rope so he could pass underneath, he scrambled under without a word. We knew we had to look natural and normal in every way. We couldn't risk calling attention to ourselves when we wanted more than anything to leap out of our skins with joy. The uniformed boys with machine guns strapped to their fronts and backs were everywhere. Anything could lead to an arrest, and this was much more serious than buying meat on the black market. Together, the four of us walked out the door in single file with our heads down, lest anyone read the apprehension in our eyes as something more than the sadness of leaving our homeland. I realized as we almost ran across the tarmac to the plane and climbed up to the stairs that in our haste we'd forgotten to give Abuelo a hug and a kiss goodbye. I turned around to see if I could catch a glimpse of him at the window, and he was there, standing as straight as a royal palm, his hands stuffed in his pockets and his guayabera crisp and white in the sun. We had all been dreading this moment, but now we couldn't wait for the plane to lift off the ground so there would be no doubt that we'd made it. The plane was full of screaming children and sobbing women and walking corpses and nervous bug-eyed young people paralyzed with shock, but we couldn't relate to their misery or their fears. We had our Papi back. "Does anyone have some champagne? How about a cigar?" There were more passengers than seats, and several people had to sit on the floor during the short flight to freedom. Mommy and Papi sat near the back, huddled together with their hands intertwined. Mommy wept and laughed and then wept some more, while Papi held her close to him. Marta and I held each other too as we heard the faint and mumbled prayers of the other passengers hum all around us. "Please, Heavenly Father, let us return soon. Blessed Mother, have mercy on us and keep us safe. Dear Jesus, don't forget our brothers and sisters who stay behind. Let us be together again soon." The roar of the engine silenced the prayers and the sobs and the complaints of the children who weren't really sure what was happening to them. In the next few minutes, over 200 hearts would be ripped from their homeland. Who might survive the trauma nobody knew, and who might be lucky enough to return and feel the warmth of the Cuban sun coursing through their veins once again, even fewer could say. The plane charged down the runway, rattling and skipping as it went, and lifted its beleaguered cargo up into the Cuban sky. Our swollen eyes peered out of small windows and watched the green of our island home become like a jewel embedded in a glistening sea. It grew smaller and smaller until it was barely a twinkling mist, a memory lost to the harshness of the glaring sun. And then it was gone. Thank you. Thank you. So my parents were very happy that day. It turned into a celebration because actually I changed the story a little bit. In this version, my grandfather bribed the clerk to let my father go in. He just lifted the rope. What really happened was that the clerk, the guy letting people go into the plane, took such pity on my mother. She had a bad knee that was wrapped. Her knee had just gone out, so she had it bandaged in a cast. I was a babe in arms, and she was pregnant with my sister, almost 8 months pregnant. So the guy took a look at her and took a look at my father, and he said, just go. Doesn't matter, you don't need papers, just go. And it was, I think, one of the most wonderful days of their lives, that they were able to stay together.
But the grandparents, they stay in Cuba.
My grandparents stayed behind for many years. Yeah. They finally were able to come over, but I think it was about 6 or 7 years before they were able to, before their numbers came up. Because after the initial wave, there were visas granted, but they were much fewer, and fewer as the years went by.
And that's also what happens in the novel. The grandparents, they go to America later on. It's quite difficult for them to adjust in the beginning to the American life.
They never really do.
No.
I think it's much harder for older people to adjust to a whole new world. My grandparents never learned English. They wanted to, but it was difficult for them, and their lives became very small because of that.
In the family, there are two girls: Nora, the oldest one, and then Martha, who's the youngest one. Is that you and your sister?
Well, kind of. I do have a younger sister that's very much like Marta. But I think what I wanted more to depict there was the different ways that people adjust. You know, there are some people who struggle and don't want to give in, and that's more the Nora character. They don't want to let go of the past. It's so hard for them to let go. And there are others who quickly adjust and forget who they are and where they come from. And I think there are problems with that as well, because there's so much richness and beauty that from wherever we're from. It doesn't have to be a different country. It can be a neighborhood. It can be a family culture. It can be anything. And assimilating too quickly and forgetting where one comes from, I think has just as many dangers as holding on to the past and not being able to accept the present. You know, there's something that the character of Alicia says to Nora at the end that I think in some ways really encapsulates the message of the novel. And she tells her in her final letter, she says, what you have to do, and this is what immigrants have to do, and what I've seen my parents do all their life, or anyone who has to deal with the great change and great grief, is you don't wait until the tears of the tears of your grief dry before you embrace your new world. You have to do both at the same time. You have to learn how to embrace the joy of a new life while you're still weeping. It's not one or the other. It's both. And you learn how to do both at the same time. And I think that's what people who've had to experience not just political revolution, but pain and great pain and change have to learn how to do, is to live with both the agony and the joy at once.
During life, that's how it is, isn't it?
That's how it is. And there are many kinds of revolutions. They aren't all political.
No, they could be in a marriage.
Yes. Yes.
What is a dream heart?
Well, dream heart, it's a concept that Beba, again, in all her wisdom, introduces in the novel. And so she talks about when you go to a new world, she's advising Nora, and she's saying, when you go to a new world, Nora, you have this new life, you're leaving here, you're going to go somewhere new. Give them your dream heart, but keep your true heart to yourself. And what she, in essence, is saying in her poetic and lovely way is, don't ever forget who you are. Don't ever forget. You have to remember the core of who you are stays the same. And then you can float into and out of all many different realities as long as you never forget your true self. And Nora finally gets it right. I think she's maybe tries to apply her advice a little bit too literally at first, and it gets her in trouble. But I think finally over time she gets that balance right.
There is something about the endings in your books. They're not entirely happy.
No, they're not.
We have to go through a lot of pain and agony. We have to accept that we can't have it all. We have to accept that some of the characters that we had a lot of hopes for, that they die, or that they have a miserable life, and people we want to get married or live their life happily ever after, they never see each other again. Why does it have to be that way, Cecilia?
In my stories, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like to say that while my stories may not always have happy endings, I do think they have hopeful endings. And, you know, there's suffering in life. There is great suffering in life. There's a wonderful psychologist called Scott Peck who wrote The Road Less Traveled. It's sort of an icon in the United States, and his book starts with, life is difficult. And there's no way you're going to get away from the suffering of life. But I think that what my characters try to do is to find meaning in the suffering and to grow from it, and rather than to reject it and try and just, live in a delusion of, I guess, artificial happiness. They embrace the suffering, but they try to figure out what it means and what's the purpose and what am I going to learn from it. So yes, my characters suffer, but I don't think they suffer meaninglessly, and I don't think they suffer just because it makes for a good story. I mean, that's, I guess, part of the therapist in me coming out, because that's what therapy is helping your clients, assisting your clients, and understanding the purpose and the reasons and the meaning of their suffering. And often when people do understand what the meaning of the suffering is, it ceases to be suffering. It becomes something else
They
in
find
one's
new
life.
meanings in life.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's growth and there's movement, I hope, and healing in spite of the suffering that my clients experience. Because that's the way that's the way I see life. I think.
Dream Heart is very close to reality when you read it. Signor Peregrino, it's different. It's mystic in a way, and it's sometimes far from reality, and sometimes you're confused. What is reality and what is a dream? And nothing is quite like you think it would be. Could you tell us, for those of the audience who haven't read Signor Peregrino, what is that book about?
Well, I think that book is about so many things, but as I think about it and reflect on it, I always have new ideas. And I was listening to somebody the other day talking, and it came to me that I think that Signor Peregrino is about the sanctity of imperfection. The main character is born with a very obvious imperfection. And but in spite of it, or because of it, she's a very evolved, compassionate, and loving person who's able to overcome some pretty tough things in her life. And it just occurred to me that, people who know and are very aware of their imperfections and their flaws tend to be also very evolved and compassionate and loving people. And those who seem to believe that they're pretty close to perfect and have it all together and are usually the ones who have the most to learn and still have the ways to go in terms of wisdom and learning and knowing how to be with others. And I think that there's some of that message in the Signor Peregrino, is that the power that this character has because of her imperfection that is so obvious to her. And then it's also a story about the sacred journeys and having faith in yourself and the kind of miracles that happen when people really believe in each other and are willing to listen to each other's stories. Really listen with all of who they are.
Jamilet in Signor Peregrino, with the big birthmark, her biggest dream is for that birthmark to go away and to find a doctor who can take it away. And she fights for that. But through that fight, she discovers that that's not where happiness is. And she gets to know a lot of people who has a lot of influence on her life and who gives new meaning to her life. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I think
she has to trust a lot of people.
She
Maybe
does.
That's
She
the
does.
key word.
Yeah. I think what she's able to do is that she has this drive. And that's important, to have a drive, to have something that you're really, really fighting for and striving for and on this journey of life. But as so often happens, the miracles that she wants aren't really the ones that are meant for her. There are other things that occur in her journey that are closer to what she really needs than she realized. So often, miracles happen and wonderful things happen in our lives, even if they aren't the ones that we were wanting. But when we realize to this mystery that life is, that often there are better things that happen for us than we even wanted. And I think that's what happens for Jamilet. She wants healing, but physical, but she receives a much deeper and more profound healing that comes through the power of a relationship with an unusual person who shares with her his wisdom and his pain.
Has any miracles happened to you in your life?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm. Which was the most important one?
Wow. Well, I don't know which one was the most important one, but the fact that I'm here today, the fact that I've been able to realize a dream of writing and sharing my little stories and my little characters with people from different parts of the world, and that people care to hear about them, is to me an incredible miracle. Because I write from a really, deep, soulful place. I don't know if people necessarily experience my stories that way. Everybody is different, but I know that's where it comes from for me. So to have, I was flying over from Copenhagen, coming to Bornholm today, and the whole time I was thinking to myself, my goodness, this is such a miracle that I'm coming here. I never thought I would ever go to a beautiful island in the middle of the Baltic Sea, living when I was growing up in my little world in California and, going through my teenage angst and all these things. Never did I dream that I would have an opportunity to share my philosophies and thoughts with all of you. To me, that is an incredible miracle.
So miracles are more related to relationships or feelings than something very big happening.
Oh, I think the most profound miracles aren't very big.
Mm.
I think miracles that happen every day, if you just pay attention.
Mm.
And in my stories, often they're little things. They're not always, my characters aren't out to rescue the world. They're not Superman or big detectives, and those are fascinating stories. I have nothing wrong against them, but my stories are about ordinary people who are still finding kind of pretty amazing things happening in their lives. And I think that's who most of us are. I don't think there are any ordinary lives.
The people in your novels give a lot to each other, also strangers. Some of them make big sacrifices. Some of them sacrifice their life and their freedom and a lot of big things. Are you aware of sacrificing in your everyday life? Maybe smaller things, but are you aware of sacrificing yourself sometimes?
I wish I'd had the courage to sacrifice myself more. And I don't think I'm very saintly in that way, I'm afraid. And maybe that's why I write about people who are, because I strive to be more like that. But I certainly have had wonderful, saintly people in my life who have made great sacrifices for me. My parents have sacrificed their lives for us. My grandparents have, they lost everything, and they tried very hard to create another life for their children that would have some kind of structure and some semblance of hope within it. And that was a great sacrifice. I think parents sacrifice for their children all the time, and their children don't always realize it. But in sometimes what appear to be small decisions, there's great heart in those decisions. So I think I've been much more the recipient of great sacrifice than I have had the opportunity to do for others. But I'm trying. I'm going to try.
Er der nogen, der har nogle spørgsmål til enten Drømmehjerte eller Senior Pellegrino, som I sidder og brænder inde med, som jeg ikke har fået stillet Cecilia endnu? Ja?
Yes, actually, thank you for that question. I'm currently right now finishing a novel called La Peregrina. And it took me a long time to get to a place where I felt that I could, because sequels are very tricky things and they're scary things, because so often they don't live up to the original. So I wanted to wait until I could be inspired. And I was inspired by a friend of mine. We were having lunch together, and he he reads quite a bit, and he was talking about these books that he enjoyed, and something he said about the way he enjoys these books made me think of, oh, this will be a great idea for a sequel, which is called La Peregrina. And for those of you who've read Señor Peregrino, this is the story of Rosa. We don't know too much about Rosa. She is the love interest of Señor Peregrino while they're doing the Camino de Santiago. And so we're going to, in this story, learn a little bit more about who she is, because she's we all know she's incredibly beautiful, but she's also a powerful woman, and we don't quite have a sense of where she gets her power from, and she's a very mystical person. So I'm having a wonderful time writing her and her background, and it's even, I think, more mystical than Señor Peregrino, but it has to be in a way to live up to the one that was there. So I hope you get a chance to read it. I'm almost finished. I should be finished in maybe a month or so. And maybe it'll mean I get to go on the Camino de Santiago again. Yeah. Would love to do that. Yes. Yes. About religion and the Camino? I did the last 150 miles with my husband. It's been about 7 years now that we did it. I think that the Camino is many things for many people. For some people it is definitely a religious journey. For some people it is a cultural journey, a mystical journey. For me it was all of that. I mean, I'm a religious person. I'm a spiritual person. And for me it's a very big part of my life. Part of what inspires my work with clients and inspires even my writing. But I also think that it's something that everybody has to answer for themselves, very individually. I think it's, I think it's beyond organized religion. I think it has to be much harder than that. People have to answer their own questions, their own big questions about God and the meaning of life and the meaning of one's life on earth. Actually, those are some of the questions that I think some of my characters are asking themselves in some ways, the stories. Was that what you meant by the religion question? Yeah? Thank you. Thank you so much.
When I read Señor Peregrino, I was very curious, what is this going to end with? Who is this girl, Jamilet? Is she related to Señor Peregrino, or aren't she related to him? And there are a lot of questions. So you're curious when you read Señor Peregrino. When you read Dreamheart, you cry. Mm-hmm. I cried and cried and cried for hours. So if you're going to buy this book, you have to prepare yourself for some Kleenex, because you're very, very touched by the story. And as I said earlier, I think that the people of Bornholm, they will relate to some of those feelings of loss. Because even though you haven't left the island yourself, probably you have a child or grandchildren who left the island. So that feeling of loss, and you will recognize that, I think.
And there is something about, I know that Bornholm is a different island from Cuba, but there is something about island culture. Yeah. It's very unique. And I only imagined it because I've never lived on an island, but I know that coming here to Bornholm even, it awakened some of that in me, and I can't help but think of what it would be like to live in Cuba and how it relates to people who live in Bornholm, and there have to be some similarities.
Yeah. It's very authentic in the book, so it's almost like I thought you had lived on an island.
I guess in my mind I have. Let me say something about the tears part, because I don't want to scare people too much, because life is hard enough without having to cry your eyes out reading a book. But I do think that I hope that one feels better though after they cry. If you do happen to shed a few tears reading the story, I think they're healing tears.
The letter that Nora receives from Alicia helps.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was one of those letters.
Yeah.
But I think it's can be very healing to cry and to express that emotion and to just, and it was for me in writing, and it was incredible release for whatever it means to, some people may focus on the relation piece of it or the loss of homeland, but tears can be very healing.
You told me earlier that you yourself cried.
Oh, yes.
Writing the book.
Yes.
Because it was a psychological journey for you.
Oh,
you came
yes.
back at last.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I still cry sometimes. I was kind of afraid I was going to cry now when I read this section. But I still cry when I read certain parts of it.
Before you get to sign the copies, I would like to ask you some questions in general about being a writer.
Sure.
What is an everyday life for a writer?
Well, everyday life is very quiet for a writer, at least externally. Internally, there's all kinds of things going on. But I get up early in the morning. I'm a very early morning writer. And I make some coffee, and I start to work, whether I feel like it or not. And there are lots of times that I don't feel like it. But I do it, and you have to be very disciplined if you're going to write a novel, or multiple novels, because the deadlines and the goals are so distant. It's very easy to tell yourself, oh, I'll do it eventually, I'll get there. I know in my mind what I'm going to do, but you have to show up on the page every single day if it's going to get done. So I do. And I try and get up out of the chair at least every hour or two and move around so that I can get the oxygen flowing, do some housework, fold some laundry, do something. Just to move around physically helps the mental activity as well. I go for long walks. Just any kind of balance in that way. But it is, by and large, a very quiet homebody, stay-at-home life. It's wonderful when you get to visit and meet readers, and it's very inspiring because you take that home with you, and those lonely, it can be lonely.
You have no colleagues during the day?
No.
No.
No. I do get a lot of messages and comments from readers, which I love, and I always reply, and that's wonderful for me, because most of my family they're somewhat interested in my projects and so on, but, they've heard it all already, they want to, they're not that, on the day-to-day of it, you're pretty much on your own, and you're with your characters, of course. They're your company.
When you wrote Dream Hearts, did you show it along the way to your family members for their comments?
No. I'm not one of those people writers, and there are many writers who will show their work on a regular basis to their certain people who are good readers, and that's a fine strategy. But I'm one of those who I only have one first reader, and that is my agent, who happens to be an incredible reader. He's a very good reader and a very good feedback, and I'm incredibly fortunate to have that kind of working relationship with him. And only after it's done, then do I carefully then show it around. But I don't show it around that much. With Dream Heart, many of my family members didn't read it till it had been published for years, even though it was dedicated to them, because it's so painful to read. And when you've had a wound like that heal a little bit, you're very careful about exposing yourself to anything that might reopen that wound. And I respected that. There's still family members of mine who haven't read it and have told me I don't know if I ever will, because it's don't want to go there again. And I understand that. I don't.
But those who read it, what was their reaction like?
I think that for the most part they felt very validated, and it was healing for them as well. I know it was for my parents. Read it after a couple of years, and some of my cousins have read it. My sisters have read it, and they're glad that they did.
How long does it take to write a novel?
Well, it takes. It depends on how much free time you have. But this novel, I was working full time when I wrote it, so it was about working full time at another job, not as a writer. It was about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, what with rewriting and going over it, because you always rewrite things constantly. You're constantly rewriting. But it's about, for me, it's I try to stay about a year, every year, have something new.
Do you read books yourself while you're in a writing progress?
I do read books while I'm writing, but I try not to read fiction while I'm writing, because it gets very confusing for me to read fiction while I'm writing fiction. When I'm finished with a novel, then I'll take a break, and then or I go on vacation or something, then I will read for pleasure.
Yeah. And you're writing La Peregrina right now?
Yes.
Yes. And you'll finish in a few months?
Hopefully sooner than that, yeah.
Okay.
I think within about a month or so I'll be finished with that.
And is there already a new novel in your head?
Oh, yes.
We'll be looking forward to that. Yeah. You've been writing about immigrants. Is that also the next project, writing about immigrants?
You mean the one that's in my head? The next project that I'm thinking about now is about it's about the friendship between 3 women who have lost their children in different ways. One to illness, one to the prison system, and another one to horrific murder. And how they help each other survive, and some pretty fantastic things happen in the story. I don't know if you've ever had a situation where in any creative art, I was with my husband going through this area of California called Joshua Tree. I don't know if anyone here has been to Joshua Tree in California, but it is the most amazing desert you'll ever see. And it's called Joshua Tree because it is a very stark landscape, with the exception of these trees that look like people. And actually they were named after somebody in the Old Testament, Joshua, who was supplicating God and raising his arms like that. And these trees look like that. And I was driving with my husband. He had a meeting out there, and I was driving by myself in this very eerie place. And all of a sudden, I was just impacted with this idea for a story. And this has never happened to me before. I went home, and I just, in 2 days, I wrote 100 pages. I'm one of these that like struggles with 2 or 3 pages a day, and I have to, and it just was there. So I'm really excited to get back to that when I finish La Peregrina, because I needed to do that first. But
it's also some kind of trauma that the people go through, and they have to find a new meaning of life and how to adjust to the situation.
Yes. And, I think in the heart of all of my stories is a mystery. And because I think that life is essentially a mystery. And with La Peregrina, for example, you said how the story ended with these questions about, well, who is she really, and who is Señor Peregrino? And so my challenge in writing a sequel was to follow that and give some satisfaction to those questions without completely solving the mystery. I think within the heart of all truth is always a mystery. So I want to keep that alive in the novel, and not answer exactly who everybody is, but yet give some meat to that too, because it's fun. It's fun and interesting.
Sounds wise. Yeah, I think the plan is for you now to sign the books. Oh, sorry. That's perfect.
Great.
Last time you told about Abuelo Antonio.
See.
Would you like to tell that story again from real life?
Sure. You mean the story about Abuelo Antonio and how he inspired the Señor Peregrino story? Yes. Sure. I will happily tell you that story.
It's a good story.
My grandfather, Abuelo Antonio, was an incredible storyteller, and he was born in the north of Spain. And when we were children, he would tell us about his life growing up. that's the way he told us about himself, was through his stories. He was a very gentle man. He never said things like, oh, you should do this or you should do that, or he never gave advice in that way because he was almost so humble that he would not do that. Instead, he would tell us stories. And some of the happiest days of my life were we'd sit at his knee, literally, while he'd sit in this old chair and start telling us of his stories. And as I got older, I would go visit him after school. And I always wondered about why he left Spain, because he was the oldest of something like 10 children. And in those days, the oldest always inherited most of the land. That's changed somewhat, but this was back in like the turn of the century. So it was always kind of a mystery, and whenever I asked my mom and dad, they were evasive about it. They wouldn't tell me much. Oh, things change, or whatever. And so one day, my family was planning to go back to Spain, to the place where he had grown up. And we wanted him to come with us, but he didn't want to come, and he just didn't want to go. And so I'd gone to visit him after school, and he was making some of his soup. He was a good cook, and he was cooking at the stove. And he said, I need to tell you something that happened to me in Spain. And so then I knew that there was a real important story here. It was just he and I. And he said, I'm going to tell you the reason that I left Spain, because you're going to go now, and I don't want you to hear this from anybody else but me first. You might hear this. I want you to hear it from me. So what he said was that when he was a young man, he fell very much in love with a young woman called Rosa, a beautiful girl that lived in the village where he lived, and it was a small village in the north of Spain. And he very much wanted to marry her. And of course there was somebody else who was in love with Rosa as well. And there was going to be a village dance. And my grandfather received word from some of the other people in the village that came to warn him. Well, actually the other boy that was in love with this girl sent a message to my grandfather that if he went to the dance, he would regret it. And he should not dance with Rosa, or he was going to regret it. And of course, in those days, if you heed a warning like that and you don't go, it's almost like saying, I'm not a man. You have to stand up for yourself, and you have to do it. But he was told that this other young man would be taking a gun to this dance. And so my grandfather also took a gun to the dance. And when he was there was Rosa. And of course he danced with Rosa. And while he was dancing with her, the other young man pulled out his gun and shot at my grandfather. He missed. But my grandfather, and he was going to shoot him again. My grandfather was a very, very good shot. He was an incredible hunter. And used his hunting skills to feed the family. Well, when he shot before the other could shoot again, he didn't miss. And he killed him. And right there. And he immediately fled because he was afraid of what would happen to him. He didn't flee the country. He went into hiding. And he was eventually found, went to trial. But there were so many witnesses that he was exonerated. This was a self-defense situation. He wasn't the one who fired the first shot, and he had to fire again to keep from getting shot. Nevertheless, those days being what they were, he knew he had to leave anyway, because the young man that he killed had many brothers, and he knew it was just a matter of time until one of them got their revenge. So he got on the first boat to Cuba. He left Rosa, he left his family, he left his inheritance, he left everything he ever knew, and he never went back. And so that was an impetus for the story of Señor Peregrino. It wasn't, for those of you who've read it, you know it isn't exactly what happens, but his story really inspired the love story between Antonio and Rosa, in my mind, in the book. And it has a better ending, I think, than my poor grandfather's story. But that is the true story of my grandfather and Rosa. And he did tell me, he had a wonderful relationship with his wife, my grandmother, Abuela Nina, and he did say that he loved Abuela Nina and he was a devoted husband and really a wonderful father, but he never forgot Rosa, ever. She was still sort of the love of his life. Abuela Nina didn't know that, though.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for being such gracious listeners. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.